Welcome to the Australian Book Review podcast. My name is Peter Rose, and I'm the editor of Australian Book Review. In recent years, few issues have so galvanised the book industry as the push in pro-free market circles to abolish restrictions on parallel importation. Past campaigns to alter the status quo were strongly opposed and ultimately defeated, but the Productivity Commission has revived the issue, and the federal government will soon consider removing the restrictions on parallel importation. The proposed introduction of a defence of fair use in copyright would also have major repercussions for Australian authors and collecting agencies such as CAL. To help us to make sense of these complex issues, I spoke to Colin Golvan QC, who specialises in the areas of intellectual property and trademark practices. Colin is an author himself as well as a former journalist. His books include Copyright Law and Practice and An Introduction to Intellectual Property Law, both published by Federation Press. Colin Golvan, who is the current chair of Australian Book Review, serves on several other boards including Museums Victoria and the Malthouse Theatre. He writes about the new threats to Australian creativity in a commentary published in the November issue of Australian Book Review. Colin Golvan, welcome to the ABR podcast.
Thanks for having me.
For many people in the industry, this is a vexed, even vexing issue, but others can struggle to comprehend the present arrangements and what's at stake here. I wonder if you could summarise the status quo and give us a sense as to what might be at stake.
Sure. Okay. Well, copyright, like most intellectual property laws, are national laws. Right? They vest national rights to rights owners and they create monopolies. Trademarks, patents, designs and copyright all do that work. Under the present Copyright Act, an Australian copyright owner and that person's licensee, or indeed a foreign copyright owner under international regulations, is allowed to control the importation of copyright works, and that's the present position. So in other words, in order to import the work from elsewhere, one presently needs to get the approval of the recognised copyright owner under Australian law. Now, there is an exception to that in the case of books which can't be accessed after some period of notice, 90 days, for private use. But that's a very narrow exception. Otherwise, the copyright owner in Australia is in control of the Australian market.
The Productivity Commission has recommended the abolition of restrictions on parallel importation and the introduction of a defence of fair use in copyright in place of the fair dealing defences. How would this impact on authors and publishers?
All right, well, that's a big question. Parallel importation is where you do import copies of works which have been made in other jurisdictions, not by pirated means, but by legitimate means. And the restriction on parallel importation is the restriction I was referring to before, which is that national copyright owners can control the importation of their works. Now, under the recommendation of the Productivity Commission, it's intended to remove that barrier which Australian copyright owners can place on unauthorised importations. There are a number of effects that I'm concerned about. First is that it inhibits the ability of copyright owners in Australia to negotiate then transactions in rights in other national territories, because if you don't have a restriction on importation, then someone could take an edition which was published in the United States, for example, and simply export it to Australia, whether the copyright owner in Australia agrees or doesn't. Now, that means, as a practical matter, that it will be impossible to negotiate separate advance arrangements against royalties in different territories. It also means that potentially a well-known writer will look to major foreign markets to publish their work first, say United States and UK, and that edition will become the edition which we receive in Australia. Now, that translates into a few problems. First is rights for Australia will be treated as being secondary rights, so the royalties paid will be significantly diminished and treated as being secondary to the primary royalties payable in the primary market, say UK or US. Secondly, it will mean that the role of the Australian publishing industry will be marginalised. It'll become essentially a selling house rather than a creative house. And that's because the work will be generated from some foreign place using foreign editors, foreign for us at least, though it might be in English, foreign language and an idiom, and any kind of semblance of there being a separate Australian edition reflecting, for example, our spelling or way of speech will be removed. And because Australia will become a dumping ground, in essence, for works published in major foreign markets, you won't need to run an Australian publishing house having publishers or editors. They're my chief concerns. On the fair use, fair dealing point, that raises another set of issues, which is at the moment we have some quite strict rules about when copyright works can be used in what's called a fair dealing context, for example, for criticism or review. The fair use defence to copyright usage means that there will be a much more open-ended entitlement to claim that a use is fair, and will have a dramatic effect on the ability of collecting societies like CAL in particular to maintain their collecting activities. And that's reflected by the American experience, where they have the fair use defence and almost no national collecting systems.
And probably some listeners don't appreciate what a significant source of income CAL returns to authors represent in this country, in a country where we know that average annual earnings by writers have fallen, not risen, in recent years. It's in a way the sleeper in this issue, isn't it?
Very much so, and I'm very worried about the impact on CAL of what might seem to be a small change of not much significance. In actual fact is what you call a sleeper. And CAL itself collects well over $100 million and distributed to authors and publishers. And there are many authors with the experience of their works being out of print, but nevertheless continue to receive, years after works are out of print, CAL payments for the copying of works by educational institutions. And that's the activity which will be put at risk by this recommendation.
Going back briefly to parallel importation, importantly, if writers are compelled to transact on a one-off basis with a publisher, usually in the United Kingdom or the United States, it will not only limit their source of advances, but also, in a sense, influence the way they write, the voice they adopt, the language, the vocabulary, but also the subject matter. That's a very significant consequence, not just for the writers themselves and their local publishers, but for readers. You know, we've had such an abundance in the past 3 or 4 decades of Australian stories. They would presumably be much less practicable for the author.
Well, the writer will be discouraged from writing about his own or her own environment just by the circumstances in which the work's being submitted for first publication. Now, of course, we do have writers that submit work for first publication in US or UK. It's a matter of choice. But the fact of the matter is we have a very vigorous and significant, economically significant Australian publishing market, which would fall into a secondary kind of role when our writers are focused so much on writing initially for the US or UK markets. And this is one of the issues about having maintaining an independent voice in writing and publishing in what's ostensibly a small country, writing in the world's first language, English. It's an enormous challenge, and I don't think those sort of considerations have received anything like the attention that they ought receive in the environment of a review of this kind. In other words, just to look at productivity questions, to look at the issue of impact on consumers is at best, for what I regard as being a kind of fairly marginal analysis, a very narrowly focused view of the world.
What is driving this desire for such momentous changes?
Well, I think that's a very profound question. It's economically driven. We have some very influential economic spokespeople who speak for eliminating monopolies in a vibrant market. Now, it's that sort of talk that's gone into, for example, dismantling trade barriers, which of course mean now that we have almost no manufacturing in Australia. Now, to a lot of economists, that's perfectly fine. We have other strengths in our economy and we should look to those and not create artificial barriers. But to liken the monopoly in copyright for example, to the monopolies around tariff barriers in the motor industry is to completely misunderstand the cultural significance of copyright as we're discussing it. And I think that a lot of this comes from a fundamental kind of misunderstanding about the cultural significance of the publishing industry. It's a very limited look at the world, which is driven by a kind of economist's focus, which itself then is kind of looking to goals like cheaper prices for consumers, eliminating trade barriers. And that kind of analysis is fine applied in its correct setting. But this is not that setting. And copyright has hundreds of years of cultural significance founded in it. In itself, the protection of the copyright owner's monopoly explains the richness of cultures throughout the world. And it's that focus which has been completely missed. And I'm not sure our politicians really get it. I think the publishing industry has been clamouring at it, and authors have been clamouring at it, but they're not getting through to the decision makers necessarily. Now, of course, at the moment, we don't have a decision, but decisions are imminent in this area and likely to be supportive of the report's ultimate conclusions, which I expect will be to endorse these changes.
And that might well be before Christmas.
It could well be, and I think we in the art sector, this sort of the sympathetic interest, haven't been able, somehow have just failed in getting to the sort of political outcome which we should be aiming for, which is to get government to be much more responsive and understanding of both the cultural and indeed the economic significance of our publishing and writing industries. We just need to be more proactive, and I'm grateful for the chance to be proactive right now.
Well, and in your article in the November 2016 issue of Australian Book Review, you make an eloquent defence of copyright and of the author's rights. I'll quote you. The federal government has been promoting the innovation economy, but is considering recommendations for legal reform which will undermine the financial and cultural interests of creators, unquote. Now, there's a real irony here, isn't there? Because you've mentioned it's a tiny country, but the local publishing sector, like our national literature itself, is really one of Australia's cultural successes. The publishing industry employs thousands of people and generates well over $1 billion in revenue. And we know that not all cultural sectors are so robust. So why is the industry under attack in this way? We well might ask.
Well, that's the very question. Why would we put all this at risk?
Yeah.
When the objective, as the report reveals, is some idea that consumers might pay less for books. It's kind of a nonsensical balance. Why are we worried about consumers in this context when the availability of information is so widespread? And if you want to access books at a cheap price, there's the electronic edition, which is invariably available at very generous pricing, at least from the buyer's point of view. What's the big deal? I mean, I think we're really kind of at a threshold point here. And it's interesting that these recommendations kind of set themselves up against copyright itself as being the major sort of matter for us to be considering. And I would be very concerned if the copyright industry lost this particular fight. It's been engaged in this fight for many years now and has been successful throughout. Government's come back time and time again and been pushing at this door. And I think it's reflective of a political ignorance about the significance of our literary culture.
Well, I agree with you that this is a very critical debate with potentially very deleterious consequences for authors, publishers, but also readers. So we'll be watching it and hoping for a positive outcome. Colin Golvan, thank you very much.
Thank you.